Here's why it's so difficult, and here's why we can confidently predict a U.S. recession. Because the inflation can come from two directions. It can come from the supply side or the demand side, sometimes both. So supply side inflation, or inflation caused from the supply side, is called cost push inflation. It comes from shortages, commodity prices, energy primarily, but energy is part of everything. If you're selling goods, you move it by truck and you need diesel fuel, or trains, cargo vessels all run on diesel pretty much. So the lights in the room where I'm sitting are run off a local power plant. They burn natural gas. And so energy affects everything, and that's been a big component of it. But it's coming from the supply side, supply chain breakdown, sanctions from the war in Ukraine, and other kinds of disruptions. And that's called cost push inflation. Costs go up because of shortages, because of bottlenecks and supply chain problems, and it gets pushed onto the consumers. That is where the inflation is coming from. It's very evident from the data. Demand side inflation is called demand pull inflation. This is mostly psychological. It's when people expect prices to go up and act accordingly. If I'm thinking about buying a refrigerator and I think the price is going to go up, I might run out and buy it right now. Say, hey, if I wait 3 months, the price is going to be higher, so I better buy it now. Well, that feeds on itself. The more people think that prices are going to go up and act on it, and they call it demand pull because you're pulling demand forward. You're buying more things, velocity of money is going up, more things faster because you expect prices to go higher. In the 1970s, we saw both. It started out as cost push inflation from the Arab oil embargo of 1973. There was another oil embargo in 1979 from Iran, but from the Iranian Revolution. But it was really the 1973 embargo that quadrupled oil prices from $3 a barrel. It sounds quaint, doesn't it? $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel, but that's a 300% increase in a very short period of time. But then what happened was there was heavy money printing on top of that. Arthur Burns, a smart man, but generally considered a failed chairman of the Fed, succumbed to political pressure, was trying to help Nixon's reelection in 1972. Nixon did get reelected, later resigned for other reasons, but the damage was done, the money supply was increased, and of course monetary policy acts with a lag. So right around the same time that the price of oil quadrupled, you had this big money supply, and then it morphed. It morphed from supply side cost push inflation into demand side demand pull inflation. Psychology changed, and then inflation really took off in the 1970s. And then Paul Volcker famously crushed it with 20% interest rates. Again, people say interest rates are really high. They've gone from 2% to 4%. Yeah, try 20%. And I lived through all that. I was a professional. I remember it very well. But there it went from supply side to demand side, and then fed it on itself, and then got crushed. Right now, we've only seen the inflation coming from the supply side. It has not morphed into the demand side, the demand pull inflation. And that's very significant for two reasons. Number one, supply side inflation tends to snuff itself out. It's what's called self-negating. I'm sure you've all heard the old expression, the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices, meaning if the cost of fuel is high enough and demand is inelastic, you got to put gas in your car no matter what, because you got to go to work. And the price has doubled. It used to be $75, let's say, to fill up your Ford F-150 pickup truck, and now it's $150. Well, you're still going to fill it up because you have to get to work or haul goods or do errands or do something. You do that twice a week, that extra $150, it comes from somewhere else. You don't go out to dinner, you don't go to a sporting event, you don't go to a concert, you skip a vacation, you don't buy a new suit or a new dress, whatever the case may be. And that subdues economic growth, and then eventually the price of oil comes back down again because demand might be inelastic unless you're unemployed, and then you're not buying any gas because you're not going anywhere. So that is self-negating. It ends itself, but it can be pretty nasty for a while. The demand pull inflation feeds on itself. It amplifies itself. It makes itself get worse and worse and worse because it's driven mainly by psychology. So we're dangerously close to the tipping point. We're dangerously close to the point at which demand pull inflation might kick in, but we're not there yet. And it's important because consumers see what I'm talking about. They see this recession coming. They can feel it in other ways. So this inflation is going to come down very quickly. The Fed is going to cause it, but they're going to cause it in ways that they don't understand. So what the Fed has is something called a terminal rate. So what is the terminal rate? Quantitatively, no one knows. And Jay Powell doesn't. I don't know. Jay Powell doesn't know. But the definition would be it's when the rate is high enough that inflation will come down on its own just because of the high rate. And it doesn't have to be higher than inflation. Some people say, well, if inflation is 7%, doesn't that mean the rate has to be 8%? Not necessarily. If inflation is 7%, it may be the case that a 5% policy rate is high enough to cause the 7 to go down eventually to 2. So again, it doesn't have to be higher than inflation, but it has to be high enough to cause inflation to come down on its own without further rate hikes. And that, they call it the terminal rate, because they say when we get there, we won't have to raise rates anymore. We'll just sit there through a period that they've already called the pause. And then the pause will just be however long it takes for inflation to come down on its own, down to 2%. Now, a couple of things about that. I said no one knows where it is. Well, right now the policy rate is 4.25%. I can tell you right now at the December 15th meeting, they're going to raise rates 50 basis points. It's been 75, 75, 75, 75 through June, July, September, and November. Next rate hike is going to be 50 basis points. And there's a little bit of market euphoria around this. It's like, oh, gee, you used to do 75, now you're doing 50. You're getting ready to cut rates. Well, no, they're not getting anywhere close to cutting rates. They're not even going to reduce by a small amount. What Powell said in November, it's not that we're going to cut rates. We might raise them by a smaller amount, but we might do more of them. So don't get too euphoric or ecstatic about the fact that we're only raising 50 basis points in December, because we might do it in December, February, March. We have the 2023 calendar, by the way. It's not secret. You can go to the Fed website, look it up. We might just keep doing it longer than you think until we get to this terminal rate. So they do 50 in December. Now you're at 475. Let's just say another 50 on February 1st. Now you're at 5.25. Is that the terminal rate? It could be. We have to see the data. As I said, Powell doesn't know, and I certainly don't. It could be, or maybe not. Maybe the inflation persists for reasons that no one quite foresees. And if it does, they'll raise them again in March and keep going. So the terminal rate could be quite high. And here's the other key point for the market, stock market cheerleaders, I call them. Powell said when we get there, when we get to what they judge to be the terminal rate, they're going to sit tight for an indefinite period, but they've hinted that it could be a year. We could be now looking at early 2024, mid 2024, before they ever cut rates, if they do. Because remember, it takes time. The pause will be, okay, we've reached the terminal rate, we believe. Inflation's coming down, but it doesn't come down all at once. We got to wait for that and to get down to 2%. So the pause could be a very long wait. So this is one of the kind of mystifying points about the U.S. stock market. I mean, it seems straightforward to me, but the market has their own dynamic. They're saying, well, if the Fed raises rates the way I've described and they cause a recession, the Fed's going to have to cut rates. That's called the pivot, the Fed pivot, and lower rates are good for tech stocks, so buy stocks. That's Wall Street. Of course, they're all salesmen. They don't do very good analysis, but they're very good at selling stuff, and that's kind of their job. But think about that for a second. What if inflation comes down faster than the Fed thinks? Does that mean they might have to cut? Well, it might, but what's good about that for stocks? I mean, if that happens, no one ever says, why did that happen? They just say, well, inflation may come down, interest rates may come down, so buy stocks. It's like, well, inflation may come down, interest rates may come down, but if it does, it's because we're in a very severe recession. Exactly what I'm forecasting. And so if that's the case, stocks are going to plunge 30, 40, 50%. So don't root for lower rates, or if you're forecasting lower rates, understand what that means. It doesn't mean the Fed chickened out. It doesn't mean life is wonderful and you should buy tech stocks. It means that we're in the very severe recession that I described, and I think we will end up there. And therefore, stocks are going to plunge. Be careful what you wish for, as they say. The Fed's timeline is get to 5.25, let's say, by March, sit tight until 2024. Inflation comes down, and then they can talk about cutting rates in 2024. That's what they're saying. My forecast is, yeah, they are going to raise rates a couple more times. They're going to over-tighten. They're going to cause a very severe recession. And when they do, they may pivot at that time. They may cut rates as early as March or maybe April or May of 2023, but it won't be for good reasons. It'll be for very bad reasons, meaning we're in a recession and stocks have plunged. So don't buy into the Wall Street chatter as far as